The morning the new doctor looked at my daughter's chart and set it down without reading past the first line, I understood that some men decide who deserves help before they ever look you in the eye. My name is Ethan Cross. I'm 36 years old, and I've spent most of my life in Cedar Falls, Montana, a town small enough that the same 40 people show up to every funeral. I run a hardware store on Main Street that my father ran before me, and before that his father, and I know the name of nearly every man who has ever bought a box of nails from me. But that afternoon in the county clinic, with my 6-year-old girl burning up in my arms and her breath coming shallow and fast, I didn't know a single thing about the man in the white coat who was about to change everything. Let me take you back, because none of this makes sense unless you understand how far back it goes. My wife, Marion, died 4 years ago when the truck she was driving hit black ice on the pass road coming home from her sister's. It was February. She was 40 minutes late, and I remember standing on the porch, watching the driveway, telling myself she'd stopped for gas. She hadn't. After the funeral, the house went so quiet I could hear the refrigerator hum from any room in it. For a long time, the only thing that got me out of bed was our daughter, Lily. She was 2 when it happened. She doesn't remember her mother, not really. She knows Marion from photographs and from the stories I tell her at bedtime. Stories I've polished so many times they've started to feel more like scripture than memory. I raised her alone. I learned to braid hair from a video a teenage girl posted online. I learned which cereal she'd eat and which she'd push away with the whole flat of her hand like an insult. I learned that a man can love a child so completely that the love itself becomes a kind of fear, a constant low hum underneath everything, the terror of losing the one person left who needs you. So when Lily spiked a fever that wouldn't break, when her cheeks went the color of ash and she stopped asking for water because she was too tired to ask for anything, I put her in the truck and drove to the clinic faster than I've ever driven in my life. Our old doctor, Doc Prentice, had retired that spring. He'd delivered Lily. He'd sat with me the night Marion died and not said a single word, just kept my coffee full until the sun came up. But Doc was gone now, living somewhere warm with his sister, and the county had brought in someone new to cover the clinic 3 days a week. His name was Dr. Grant Holloway, and I'd heard he came from a big hospital back east, that he was young and sharp and didn't much care for the pace of a town like ours. What I hadn't heard was that he had a way of looking at working people like they were a line item on a page that had come out wrong. I carried Lily into the waiting room, and the receptionist, a kind woman named Deb, took one look at us and waved me straight back. Holloway was standing at the counter of the exam bay, scrolling through something on a tablet. He glanced up, glanced at Lily, and glanced back down. "Insurance card," he said. "Not hello, not what's wrong with her. Insurance card." I told him she was struggling to breathe, that her fever had been climbing for 2 days and nothing was bringing it down, that she'd gone limp in the truck on the way over. He nodded the way a man nods when he's already thinking about lunch. And he said the county coverage for uninsured minors required pre-authorization, and that without it he could only stabilize, not treat, and that I'd need to drive her to the regional hospital 90 minutes away. I stood there holding my daughter, feeling the heat coming off her small body through my jacket. And I said the regional hospital was 90 minutes away and she didn't have 90 minutes, look at her. And he said, without looking at her, that those were the rules, and that if I had a problem I could take it up with the county. There's a particular kind of helplessness that lives in the body, not the mind. My hands started shaking and I couldn't make them stop. I've built houses. I've dug graves. I once held a man's severed finger on ice in the back of my truck for 2 hours while I drove him to help. I am not a man who panics, but standing in that clinic, watching a doctor turn back to his tablet while my child struggled to pull air into her lungs, I felt something in me start to come apart. And that was the moment the nurse walked in. She was maybe 30, dark hair pulled back, tired eyes, the kind of steady presence you feel before you ever see it. Her name tag said C. Reyes. She took one look at Lily and crossed the room fast, pressing 2 fingers to my daughter's throat, her cheek, tilting her head to listen to her breathing without being asked. Then she turned to Holloway and said his name once, low, like a warning. He said the county protocol was clear, and she said something I will remember for the rest of my life. She said, quiet enough that it was almost just for me, "That man saved your life once." The room went still. Holloway looked up. Finally, actually looked. First at her and then at me, and something moved across his face that I couldn't read. He said he didn't know what she meant, and Nurse Reyes didn't explain. She just took Lily out of my arms with a gentleness that undid me, laid her on the exam table and said to me, "Sir, I've got her, but I need you to trust me for the next 10 minutes and not ask questions." I trusted her. God help me. I trusted a woman I'd never met because she was the only person in that room acting like my daughter was a human being. What happened next happened fast. She started an IV. She got fluids running, got a cool cloth on Lily's forehead, got oxygen flowing through a little tube under her nose. And all the while she was talking to my daughter in a low, even voice, telling her she was doing great, telling her the medicine was going to make the fire feel smaller. And I watched Holloway watch her, and I watched him make a decision. He set the tablet down. He rolled up his sleeves. Whatever the nurse's words had done to him, they'd cracked something open, because for the next hour, that man worked on my daughter like her life was the only thing that mattered in the world. It turned out to be pneumonia, the fast and frightening kind that fills a small chest quicker than anyone expects. Another few hours, the nurse told me later, and it might have been a very different afternoon. But it wasn't. Lily's fever broke a little past 6. Her breathing eased. She opened her eyes and asked in the smallest voice whether she could have the purple popsicle, and I laughed and cried at the same time, standing there in that fluorescent-lit room, because the purple popsicle meant she was going to be all right. Nurse Reyes stayed the whole time, long past when her shift should have ended. And when Lily finally drifted into a real sleep, the healing kind, I stepped out into the hallway, and I asked her the question that had been sitting in my chest since she'd said those 7 words. "What did you mean that I saved your life?" She leaned against the wall and looked at me for a long moment, deciding something. Then she said, "You don't remember me." I told her I was sorry, but no, I didn't. And she said, 11 years ago, the blizzard, the pass road." And the memory came back all at once, the way memories do when someone reaches into you and pulls the right thread. 11 years ago, there'd been a storm so bad the state closed the highway. I'd been driving home from a delivery, chains on my tires, going 10 miles an hour through whiteout when my headlights caught something off the shoulder. A car in the ditch, nose down, half buried already. I'd stopped. Of course I'd stopped. There was a girl inside, 19 or 20, no coat worth the name, hands gone white, engine dead, phone dead, and she'd been there long enough that she'd stopped shivering, which anyone who lives in this country knows is the dangerous part. I got her into my truck. I put my own coat on her and cranked the heat and drove her the last 8 miles to the hospital at a crawl, and I stayed until they told me she'd be fine, and then I went home and I never thought about it again. Because that's the thing about a small, decent life. You do these things and you forget them. They don't feel like anything. They feel like what a person is supposed to do. "That was me," she said. "Camilla." I moved away for nursing school right after. My mother always told me that if I ever met you again, I was supposed to make sure you knew what you'd done. She said you probably had no idea. I didn't know what to say. So I said the only true thing, "I'm just glad you're all right." And she gave me a look then. A look I'd get to know very well in the months that followed. A look that said she found me both exhausting and worth the trouble. "You're glad I'm all right," she repeated. "Your daughter almost died an hour ago, and you're glad I'm all right." I told her that seemed like the important part. She shook her head, but she was smiling. That was the beginning, though I didn't know it yet. Lily stayed 2 nights in the clinic for observation. Camilla was there for both of them, and I noticed things about her the way you notice the weather changing, slowly and then all at once. I noticed she hummed under her breath when she thought no one was listening. I noticed she gave Lily the good stickers, not the county-issued ones. I noticed she'd stopped calling me sir. On the second night, when Lily was asleep and the clinic had gone dark and quiet, Camilla brought me a cup of coffee I hadn't asked for and sat down in the chair across from me, and we talked. Really talked? The way you do at 2 in the morning in a hospital when the ordinary rules of conversation have burned away. She told me she'd become a nurse because of that night in the storm, that lying in that hospital bed with her hands wrapped in warm towels, she'd decided she wanted to be the person who showed up. She told me she'd come back to Cedar Falls 3 months ago to be near her aging mother, and that the job at the county clinic was the only one available, and that working under Grant Holloway was slowly grinding her down. She told me he was a good doctor when he chose to be, but that he'd stopped choosing. That somewhere back east something had happened to him, a lawsuit or a burnout or both, and he'd built a wall between himself and everyone who walked through the door. I asked her why she'd said those words to him, why she'd known they would work, and she said, because underneath all that ice, he still remembers why he became a doctor. Sometimes people just need someone to remind them who they used to be. I've thought about that sentence 1,000 times since. In the weeks that followed, I found reasons to see her. This is the part where I should be honest with you. Because if you've ever fallen for someone slowly, so slowly you didn't notice until you were already gone, you'll know how ridiculous a grown man can be about it. I started shopping for groceries at the store near the clinic instead of the one near my house. I discovered that the clinic's front porch railing was loose and volunteered to fix it on my own time for free. I found out which afternoon she did the town's flu shots, and I decided at 36 that I was overdue for mine. She saw through all of it. Every single time. And she let me get away with it anyway, which is how I knew, or started to hope. Lily fell in love with her first and faster, the way children do. Camila taught her a clapping game with a rhyme in Spanish. She showed her how to whistle. One Saturday, I brought Lily by the clinic to drop off a pie I'd bought and pretended to have baked, and Lily asked Camila, right there in the waiting room, plain as anything, whether she would come to her birthday party. And Camila looked at me over my daughter's head, and I looked back, and neither of us said anything for a long second. Only if your dad makes the cake, she finally said. I've heard he's a very good baker. I told her I'd learn. Not everyone in town was happy about it. That's the thing about a place this small. Everyone has an opinion, and most of them feel entitled to share it. There was talk. There was always talk. A widower and the new nurse, a girl half the men in town had already noticed. But the real trouble didn't come from the gossips. It came from Grant Holloway, and it came in a way I never saw coming. It was late spring when I found out Camila's job was in danger. The county was cutting the clinic's budget, and there was room for exactly one full-time nursing position, and Holloway, as the supervising physician, got to recommend who filled it. There was another candidate, a woman named Sandra Poole, who happened to be the sister-in-law of a county commissioner, and who happened to have half of Camila's experience and none of her heart. Camila told me about it one evening on the clinic porch, sitting on the railing I'd fixed, and she tried to make it sound like it didn't matter, like she'd find something else. But I heard the crack in her voice. If she lost this job, she'd have to leave. And if she left, her mother would be alone, and Lily would lose the second person she'd ever loved, and I would lose the first thing that had made me feel alive since Marion died. So I did something I'm not proud of, and would do again in a heartbeat. I went to see Grant Holloway. I found him at the clinic after hours, alone, doing paperwork under a single desk lamp. He looked up when I came in, and I could see he knew why I was there before I opened my mouth. I told him he owed me. I said it plainly. I told him he could keep pretending he didn't remember what his nurse had said in that exam room, but that we both knew a girl had frozen in a ditch 11 years ago and lived, and that she was the reason my daughter was alive today, and that if he had a shred of the doctor left in him that he'd been the day he took his oath, he'd do the right thing and keep her on. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said something that surprised me. He said, "You think I don't want to?" And I didn't understand. He set down his pen. And Grant Holloway, the man I'd hated for 6 weeks, told me the truth. The commissioner had made it clear. Recommend Sandra Poole, or the county would find reasons to question Holloway's own contract. Dig into an old malpractice claim from back east that had followed him here, the very thing that had hollowed him out in the first place. He was being squeezed, and a man who's already lost his nerve once will do almost anything not to lose it again. I became a doctor to help people, he said, and his voice was raw in a way I hadn't thought him capable of. And now I spend my days deciding who I can afford to help. Do you know what that does to a person? I told him I had some idea. Then I told him the same thing his nurse had told me because it seemed like the only thing worth saying. Sometimes people just need reminding who they used to be. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he asked me to leave, and I did. And I drove home not knowing whether I'd made things better or worse. The answer came 2 weeks later, at the county budget meeting, which in a town like ours is held in the elementary school gymnasium with folding chairs and bad coffee, and which nobody usually attends. But word had gotten around. Somebody had let it slip that the nursing decision was on the agenda, and by the time I got there with Lily's hand in mine, the gym was fuller than I'd ever seen it. Camilla was there near the back, and she looked at me like she was asking what I'd done. I didn't have an answer. The commissioner ran the meeting like it was already decided. He got to the nursing position, and he said the recommendation had come in, and he was pleased to move that the county appoint Sandra Poole. And he asked if the supervising physician had anything to add for the record, expecting, I'm sure, a rubber stamp. And Grant Holloway stood up. He stood up in front of the whole town, in front of the commissioner who was holding his career like a stone over a well, and he said, "Yes, I have something to add." The gym went quiet. He said that as the supervising physician, he could not in good conscience recommend Sandra Poole. He said that in his professional judgment, and by every measure that mattered, Camilla Reyes was the finest nurse he had worked with in 20 years of medicine. In a small town or a big hospital, it made no difference. He said she had, on more than one occasion, caught things he had missed. And then he said the part that made the commissioner go white. He said, 6 weeks ago, a child was brought into this clinic in respiratory distress. I made a decision that, had it stood, might have cost that child her life. I made it because I had stopped seeing patients as people. Nurse Reyes saw what I couldn't. She reminded me of my obligation, and she saved a little girl's life while I stood there worrying about paperwork. If this county wants to talk about who is qualified, let's talk about it honestly on the record, with everyone in this room as witnesses. The commissioner tried to cut him off. He said this was highly irregular, that personnel matters weren't the venue for, and Holloway raised his voice just once and said, "You want to question my contract? Do it here, do it now, in front of everyone. Ask me about my past. I'll answer every question honestly, and then we can ask you why the woman you're recommending happens to be your wife's sister." You could have heard a pin drop, and then from the back of the gym, Camilla stood up. She said she hadn't planned to speak. She said she'd spent her whole career trying not to be the kind of person who made things about herself, but that she'd come back to this town because it was where her life had been saved by a stranger who never asked for anything, and that she'd learned from that stranger that you show up for people whether or not it costs you something, especially when it costs you something. And she said if the county wanted to give the job to someone else, that was their right, but that she'd keep showing up for the people of Cedar Falls one way or another, because that was who she was, and no committee could vote that out of her. I looked at my daughter, sitting beside me swinging her legs, too young to understand what was happening, but old enough to feel the electricity in the room. And I stood up too. I'm not a man who speaks in public. My hands were shaking the way they'd shaken in the clinic, but I told them all who Camilla was. I told them about the blizzard, about the ditch, about a 19-year-old girl who'd nearly frozen to death and grown up to be the person who saved my child. I told them that this town liked to tell itself stories about looking out for its own, and that here was a chance to actually do it, standing right in front of us. And I said the last part looking straight at her, not caring anymore who heard. I said, I've been given a second chance at a lot of things I thought I'd lost. I'd like this town to give her one too. The room was silent for a moment that felt like an hour. Then Deb, the receptionist, started clapping. And then Doc Prentice's old fishing partner started clapping. And then the whole gym was clapping, and the commissioner was sitting very still with his jaw tight, and I knew, the way you know the weather's turned, that it was over. The county board voted that night, in front of everyone, and they gave the job to Camilla Reyes by a margin that wasn't close. The commissioner didn't run for re-election the following year. Grant Holloway kept his contract, and something in him seemed to have loosened its grip, because in the months that followed, I watched him become the doctor he must have been before the world got to him. He and I are friends now, which is the strangest sentence I've written in this whole story, but there it is. He comes to Lily's birthday parties. He's a terrible baker, and he brings a cake every year anyway, and Lily eats a polite slice and then asks for mine. As for Camilla and me, we married the following autumn. On a clear, cold Saturday, in the little church where we'd buried Marion, which some people thought was strange, but which felt to me like the most natural thing in the world. Because grief and love have never lived as far apart as people pretend. Lily was the flower girl. She took the job with the seriousness of a surgeon. Camilla's mother sat in the front row and cried and told anyone who'd listened that she'd always known, that she'd sent her daughter back to this town for a reason, and maybe she had. We stood at the altar, and I looked at the woman a 19-year-old version of me had pulled from a ditch in a storm, without knowing, without ever imagining, that I was saving the person who would one day save my daughter and then save me. There's a thing I understand now that I didn't before. When you do a good thing and forget it, it doesn't disappear. It goes out into the world and it waits. It waits 11 years if it has to, through a blizzard and a nursing school and a woman's whole becoming. And then one afternoon, when you're standing in a clinic with your dying child in your arms and no help in sight, it comes back and it saves the thing you love most. That night in the storm, I thought I was just a man who'd stopped his truck. I had no idea I was writing the first line of the only story that ever mattered. On our wedding night, after the guests had gone and Lily was asleep between us because she'd refused any other arrangement, Camilla whispered something to me in the dark. She said, "My mother was right. She always said the man who saved me would need saving one day." And I asked her how she'd known it would be me who needed it. And she said the truest thing anyone has ever said to me. She said, "I didn't know it would be you. I just knew that when someone shows up for you in the cold, you spend the rest of your life ready to show up for them. I've been ready for 11 years. I was just waiting to find out who I was waiting for." And I held my wife and my daughter in the quiet dark of a house that used to echo. And for the first time in a very long time, the silence didn't sound like something I'd lost. It sounded like something I'd finally been given back.